Tokyo, the last week of August 1941. Heat sits in the wooden window frames. A ceiling fan turns slowly above a long table, and 35 young men in summer shirts stack the last pages of a document they have spent the whole season assembling. They are not generals. Some came from the ministries, some from the banks, some from newspapers. Their average age is barely past 30. For 3 months they have been given something no army had asked of them before. Real production figures, real oil reserves, real tonnage lists for every merchant ship the empire owns, and a single instruction: form a cabinet and play the war with the United States from the first shot to the last. A hand smooths the cover page. Somewhere below the window, cicadas grind in the ginkgo trees along the palace moat. The report says Japan will lose. It says the early victories will come. It says the merchant fleet will begin to die. It says the oil will run down, and the factories will starve, and the empire will come apart from the inside. The pages are carried into a room where the cabinet is waiting. Among the men listening is the Minister of the Army, 56 years old, round wire spectacles, a face that gives nothing back. He hears the whole thing out. His hands stay folded. Then he tells them that what they have produced is a desk exercise, paper and arithmetic. He reminds them that in 1904 against Russia, every table of numbers said Japan would lose, and Japan won anyway. There are elements in war, he says, that cannot be measured. The young men gather their pages, and he tells them not to speak of it outside that room. In 8 weeks, that man will be Prime Minister. In 100 days, aircraft will lift off 6 carrier decks in the freezing northern Pacific and turn toward Hawaii. The most common explanation for what they did is that they never understood the country they were attacking. Their own paperwork tells a far more disturbing story. They were installed in a body called the Total War Research Institute, which answered to the cabinet. They were handed real production figures, real oil reserves, real merchant tonnage, and they were told to form a mock cabinet and play the entire war, from the first shot to the last. They worked through the summer heat of 1941. Then they wrote a report. The report said Japan would lose. By the accounts of men who were in that room, recorded years later, it did not hedge. It said the empire would enjoy early success. It said the merchant fleet would then begin to die. It said the oil would run down, and the factories would starve, and the whole structure would come apart from the inside. It said that in the final stage, the Soviet Union would enter the war against them. It did not foresee the atomic bomb, but the broad architecture of Japan's defeat was already on the page. The findings were presented before members of the cabinet in late August. Among the men listening was the Minister of the Army, a 56-year-old officer in round wire spectacles named Tojo Hideki, who would be Prime Minister within 8 weeks. By the recollections of those present, he heard the whole thing out. Then he told them, in substance, that what they had produced was a desk exercise, a thing made of paper and arithmetic. He reminded them that in 1904, against Russia, Japan had been outweighed on every table of numbers and had won anyway. There were elements in war, he said, that could not be measured. And then he told them not to discuss it outside the room. One of the most persistent popular explanations for Pearl Harbor is that Japan simply failed to understand the country it was attacking. Its own paperwork tells us a more disturbing story. Tokyo, late August of 1941. The heat in the capital that summer was the wet, breathless kind that settles into wood and paper and does not leave. Cicadas screamed in the ginkgo trees along the palace moat. And inside a government building not far from that water, 35 people finished a piece of work that would be filed and set aside and then left at the edges of the story for most of a century. To understand why a nation walks into a war it has already lost on paper, you have to go back further than 1941. You have to go back to a coastline. Look at the Japanese home islands from above. 4 main islands, thousands of smaller ones, a mountainous spine running the length of them. Very little flat ground. Beautiful country, difficult country for an empire. Because for a modern industrial war machine, those islands lacked several things that mattered desperately. Above all, petroleum, along with adequate supplies of high-grade iron ore, bauxite, and a range of other strategic raw materials that a 20th century military needs in enormous quantities and cannot improvise. Japan had coal. Japan had skilled labor, disciplined engineers, and shipyards that could build anything. What Japan did not have was the ability to feed those machines from its own ground. That was not always a problem, because for 2.5 centuries Japan had not needed machines. Then, in the 1850s, American warships arrived in Edo Bay and made it very clear that isolation was no longer on the menu. What followed was one of the most violent compressions of history any country has ever performed on itself. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration. And over the next 44 years, a feudal society with samurai and rice stipends rebuilt itself into an industrial nation-state with railways, telegraphs, conscription, a modern navy, and a written constitution. They did it by copying, deliberately, systematically, without embarrassment. Prussian army organization, British naval doctrine, French legal codes, American schooling. Young men were sent abroad by the hundreds to learn and came home and built. And here is what most tellings of this story leave out. They were not only copying the West because they admired it, they were copying the West because they had watched what the West had done to China and had decided they wouldn't be next. Fear was one of the engines of what followed. Fear of becoming what China had become in Western eyes, vulnerable, divided, and subject to foreign power. That fear was learned by watching the Opium Wars and the carving of the Chinese coast into foreign concessions, and it was entirely rational. By 1905, Japan had beaten Russia, a European great power, on land and at sea. The world noticed. Japan noticed harder. Resource insecurity then became another powerful argument for expansion. Growth meant industry. Industry meant raw material. The islands did not have it, but it was never the only argument. Strategic security, nationalism, imperial ideology, the hunger for status among the great powers, the ambitions of an increasingly autonomous military, and hard commercial interest all pushed in the same direction. Korea was annexed in 1910. Manchuria was seized in 1931. Each step was justified with a different mixture of those reasons, and each step made the next one easier to justify. By the 1930s, under the Showa era, those pressures had fused into a system that increasingly treated expansion not as a choice, but as a necessity, and the army had become a political actor that killed politicians who obstructed it. In 1932, a prime minister was shot dead in his own residence. In 1936, young officers seized a section of central Tokyo and killed senior statesmen in their homes. The rebellion was crushed, but the message landed permanently in the ear of every civilian in government. Oppose the army, and you may not survive the year. That is the country. Small, industrialized, resource-anxious, brilliant, frightened, and increasingly run by men who had learned that violence worked. Now put a war on top of it. On the night of July 7, 1937, Japanese troops were conducting exercises near a stone bridge outside Peking. The bridge is called Lugu. Westerners call it the Marco Polo Bridge. Shots were exchanged in the dark. A Japanese soldier was briefly unaccounted for. He turned up. It did not matter. Among the Japanese officers on the ground that night was a career infantryman named Ichiki Kiyonao. Unremarkable in the way that most of the men who start wars are unremarkable. Remember his name. He will come back into this story 5 years and 4,000 miles from that bridge, at another crossing point, in another darkness. And what happens to him there will explain more about this war than any battle map ever could. The clash at the bridge became the Second Sino-Japanese War, and it never stopped. It swallowed the Japanese army whole. Hundreds of thousands of men, then a million, then more, feeding into an interior that did not end. The army had promised a quick resolution. It got a war that would still be running 8 years later. And in the course of that war, the Imperial Japanese Army committed atrocities against Chinese civilians on a scale that would later be documented in evidence before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. That is a matter of legal record. This story is not going to describe those events, and it is not going to use them for effect. But it is not going to walk past them either, because they matter to the argument. Here is why they matter. For the next 2 hours, you are going to hear evidence that the Japanese leadership was frightened. Specifically, documentably frightened in ways that popular memory of this war has almost entirely lost. And there is a lazy conclusion waiting at the end of that evidence, which is that fear somehow softens what the empire did. It does not. The fear does not reduce the crimes. It became one of the forces that made an already violent imperial system more ruthless and less capable of correcting itself. Hold both facts at once, because both are true and because the second one is the entire point of this story. There was an American living in Japan through all of it. His name was Sherwood Moran. He was born in Ohio in 1885, and he went out to Japan in 1916 as a congregational missionary, a young man with a wife, a calling, and no particular expectation of ever coming home. He stayed for the better part of 25 years. He raised his children there. He preached and taught and buried neighbors. And he learned the language the way you only learn a language when you live inside it. Not the careful textbook Japanese of the diplomatic service, but the ordinary spoken Japanese of shopkeepers and farmers and men complaining about the rain. He learned to read a room in Japanese. He learned what people say when they are being polite and what they say when they are not. He was there for the 1920s, when Tokyo had jazz records and baseball and department stores. And he was there for the 1930s, when the men in his neighborhood stopped talking about certain things in public, and the school books changed, and the boys of families he knew started disappearing into the army and coming back from China different, or not coming back at all. Sherwood Moran watched a country he loved turn into something else, 1 year at a time, from the inside. When it became clear where this was going, he came home. And he arrived in the United States with a body of knowledge almost no American possessed. Not the strategic knowledge of an attaché or an analyst, but the ground level, human knowledge of a man who had spent half his life listening to Japanese people talk about their lives. He was 56 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Hold on to him. He comes back twice. The war in China angered the United States, not enough to intervene militarily, enough to reach for a different instrument. Washington began restricting exports, aviation fuel, machine tools, scrap iron and steel. Each restriction tightened by a notch, and each one landed on a country that bought a great deal of its industrial lifeblood from the very nation it was antagonizing. Japan imported close to 9/10 of the petroleum it consumed, and roughly 4/5 of that supply came from the United States. American scrap iron and steel also fed a crucial part of Japan's industrial system, important enough that when Washington moved against scrap exports in 1940, Tokyo protested with unusual force. The Japanese Navy, the fleet that would eventually attack Pearl Harbor, ran on American petroleum. There is no way to say that which makes it sound less strange. Then, in July of 1941, Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, modern Vietnam. Airfields there put Japanese bombers within range of Singapore, the Philippines, and the oil of the Dutch East Indies. It was, unmistakably, a move to position for further conquest. On July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States. The freeze was not, on paper, a total oil embargo. Licenses were supposed to be issued. Some trade was supposed to continue. But in the implementation, in the machinery of who released what funds and who signed which paper, the licenses stopped moving. By the end of that summer, the effect was absolute. The oils stopped. Britain and the Netherlands followed. Almost overnight, an industrial empire fighting a continental land war lost access to the fuel that ran it. Now hold in your mind what happens inside a room in Tokyo when that news arrives. Someone opens a file. Someone reads out the reserve figure. The Navy has perhaps 2 years of oil in storage if it does nothing at all. Less if it fights. Every day that passes, the number goes down and cannot be replaced. You are not watching a nation decide whether to go to war. You are watching a nation watch a clock. And that clock was not only a strategic problem. For the men in those rooms, it confirmed something they had believed for 2 generations, that Western powers would decide the fate of Asian nations from a distance, with a signature, and that Japan's independence existed at Western sufferance. They experienced the embargo as an act of war, which brings us to a booklet. In January of 1941, a lieutenant colonel was posted to a small research section attached to the Taiwan Army. Its job was to study tropical warfare, how to move and fight and survive in jungle and rubber plantation, in heat that kills equipment and men. His name was Tsuji Masanobu. He was 38 that January and would turn 39 that autumn. He was a small man, physically slight, with a shaved head and an intensity that people who met him tended to describe in the same handful of words. Brilliant, fanatical, impossible. He had come from nothing, a charcoal maker's son from Ishikawa Prefecture, and had climbed the military academy system on pure ability, graduating near the top of his class. He neither drank nor smoked nor visited the establishments his fellow officers visited, and he made certain everyone knew it. He wrote constantly, he talked constantly, and he had already developed the habit that would define his career and cost tens of thousands of lives. Tsuji did not respect the chain of command. He was a staff officer, which meant he commanded nothing. He planned, he advised. But he had discovered that if you arrive at a headquarters with total certainty, speaking on behalf of higher authority, nobody can immediately verify, and if you are willing to frame every disagreement as a question of your opponent's courage, you can make things happen anyway. He had done it in Manchuria. He would do it in Malaya, in the Philippines, in the Solomon Islands, in Burma. But in 1941, in a hot office in Taiwan, none of that had happened yet. In 1941, he was simply a very clever officer with a research posting and a printing budget, and he sat down to write a book for soldiers. It was a small thing. Something like 70 pages, in language deliberately simple, aimed at men who had never left the home islands and were about to be shipped into a world of malaria and mangrove and total humidity. It told them how to purify water, how to prevent foot rot, how to behave aboard a transport, how to think about heat. The title was a promise all by itself. Read this alone, and the war can be won. It was distributed widely to troops embarking for the southern campaigns. Tsuji himself later claimed that some 40,000 copies went out to officers heading south, and the pamphlet reached soldiers packed into holds in the dark, in ships that stank of oil and vomit on the way to the beaches. Most of it was practical. Much of it was genuinely good advice, and woven all the way through it was something else. Open it, and the first thing that hits you is not hatred, it is grievance, and the grievance is not entirely wrong, which is precisely what makes the document so dangerous. The booklet told the Japanese soldier that the peoples of the Far East had been overrun by Europeans and Americans who arrived by sea and behaved as though the region belonged to them by natural right, that the wealth of Asia had been taken by a small number of white men, that tens of millions of Asians had lived for generations under exploitation and contempt, that the colonized peoples of the region were waiting for someone to break that arrangement, and that Japan was the only power capable of doing it, now. The British ruled India, Burma, Malaya. The French ruled Indochina. The Dutch ruled the East Indies. The Americans ruled the Philippines. Racial hierarchy was not invented by Japanese propagandists. It was written into the immigration law of the United States and into the club rules of Singapore. So when Tsuji told a farm boy from Niigata that white empires had carved up Asia and grown rich on it, he was telling him something true. That is the first great trap of this story, and it explains why the lie worked. The lie worked because it was welded to a fact. Wrapped around that true core was a second claim that Japan's own expansion was liberation rather than conquest, and wrapped around that was a third claim, which is the reason we are here. The booklet described the enemy. It told the men on those transports that the soldiers they were about to fight were weaker than the Chinese armies. Japan had already been fighting for 4 years, that the Westerner was soft, effeminate, cowardly, that he disliked fighting in rain, in mist, at night, that he had grown fat on the labor of colonized peoples and had lost the capacity to endure hardship. And it described the embargo in an image that a young soldier reading by a shaded bulb in a rolling ship would not forget. America, it said, had been shutting off Japan's oil and steel slowly, little by little, like a man strangling his victim with a soft cord of silken floss. Read that image again because it tells you exactly what the author wanted his reader to feel. Not rage, not confidence, suffocation. One of the most effective pieces of contempt propaganda produced by the Japanese Empire opens by telling its own soldiers that they are being murdered slowly by a coward. Both halves are load-bearing. If the enemy is merely contemptible, there is no urgency. If the enemy is merely powerful, there is no hope. Put them together, and you get a man who believes he must strike now and believes he can win when he does. That combination is not confidence. That is what fear sounds like when it is trying to pass for confidence. Now meet the other man. Yamamoto Isoroku was 57 in 1941, and he was Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the most powerful operational post in the Japanese Navy. He was short even by the standards of his generation. 2 fingers were missing from his left hand, taken by a shell burst at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when he was a 21-year-old ensign. There is a story that geisha in Tokyo joked he was cheap because manicures were priced by the finger. It may or may not be true. His contemporaries enjoyed repeating it. He gambled, constantly, and well. Poker, bridge, chess, shogi, go, and anything else that could be played for stakes. He once said, in effect, that if he had been allowed to spend his life at cards, he could have made a fortune. It was not a hobby, it was a way of thinking. Yamamoto understood in his bones the difference between a good hand and a good position, and the difference between a bet you can afford and one you cannot. And Yamamoto had been to America. This is one of the most important facts in the whole of this story. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard. From 1926 to 1928, he served as naval attaché in Washington. He did not spend those years in embassy receptions. He traveled. He went to Mexico to look at oil. He crossed the United States and looked at the industrial interior, the steel, the automobile plants, the sheer, stupid, endless scale of the place. He read American newspapers. He learned to think in American numbers. And what he understood, which few others in the Japanese High Command understood in the same physical way, was this: America is not merely a country. It is a machine for making things, and it is very hard to find the bottom of it. Here is the arithmetic he carried in his head. American steel production ran to many times Japan. American factories built millions of motor vehicles a year. Japanese factories built a small fraction of that. The United States sat on top of the world's largest oil industry, while Japan pumped almost nothing from its own soil and had just been cut off from the source that supplied it. In a short war, none of that decides anything. In a long war, it decides nearly everything. Yamamoto opposed the war. He opposed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. He opposed it loudly enough and long enough that army-aligned nationalists began making threats against his life. And in 1939, the Navy moved him to Sea Command, partly to get him out of assassination range in Tokyo. And in September of 1940, in conversation with Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, Yamamoto said the thing he is remembered for. Konoe asked him what would happen if Japan fought the United States and Britain. Yamamoto answered that if he were ordered to fight regardless of the consequences, he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year. After that, he said, he had no confidence at all, none, for the second year and the third. Sit with the structure of that sentence. It is not a warning. A warning implies avoidance is possible. That is a man describing the length of a fall. And now, because this is a story about the difference between what the Japanese actually said and what popular memory decided they said, we have to take something away. You know the line. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. It has been in documentaries, textbooks, speeches, and a million social media posts for 60 years, always attributed to Yamamoto, usually placed on a carrier deck on the afternoon of December 7th. There is no contemporary source for it, no diary, no letter, no dispatch, no witness statement from the day. Its origin appears to be the screenplay of the 1970 film Tora. Tora, Tora! It is a beautiful line. A screenwriter wrote it. The same is true of the other one, that America could never be invaded because there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. That has been traced to nothing at all. It appears to be a post-war invention. Why interrupt the story for that? Because it is the pattern of this entire subject. The real quotation is more unsettling than the invented one. The commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet warned the prime minister that he could fight successfully for 6 months, or perhaps a year, and had no confidence at all in a prolonged war. He said it more than a year before the attack he himself would design. The fabricated line makes the empire look surprised. The real one makes it look like something much worse. Autumn 1941. The Japanese state moved toward war through a series of formal meetings called imperial conferences, held in the presence of the emperor. They followed a script. The emperor, by convention, did not speak. He sat and listened, and the decision was taken in front of him, and his silence was treated as assent. Hirohito was 40 years old, slight, myopic, uncomfortable in public, a serious amateur marine biologist said to be happiest with specimens and a microscope. Whatever his private view of the war, and historians still argue over it fiercely, his political position was constrained in ways that are easy to underestimate. The men who murdered a prime minister in 1932 and senior statesmen in 1936 had all claimed to be acting in his name. On September 5, 1941, the day before one of these conferences, he summoned the 2 service chiefs for a private audience. He asked the chief of the Army General Staff, General Sugiyama Hajime, how long a war in the South would take. Sugiyama said operations in the southern region could be completed in about 3 months, and the emperor did something he almost never did. He pushed back. He reminded Sugiyama that in 1937, as army minister, Sugiyama had said the conflict in China would be settled in roughly a month. It had now been running more than 4 years. Sugiyama, cornered, said China had a vast hinterland, and Hirohito answered that if the Chinese interior was vast, the Pacific Ocean was vast. Sugiyama, according to the record, had nothing to say. That exchange is preserved. It sits in the Japanese archival record, and it is the plainest evidence we have that the man at the very top of the imperial structure could see, in September of 1941, that his army's assurances did not survive contact with a map. The following day, September 6, the Imperial Conference met formally. The chief of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Nagano Osami, 61 years old, laid out the Navy's position. It was not a promise of victory. It was closer to a diagnosis. The fleet was consuming stockpiled oil every day. If Japan waited, the reserves would fall, the ships would eventually be unable to move, and the empire would lose the ability to fight without a shot being fired. If Japan struck now, there was at least a chance. Read that argument carefully, because it is the argument of a man who has already been beaten and is choosing the manner of the defeat. Not "we will win," but "if we wait, we lose for certain." And then at the end, the emperor broke protocol. He drew out a piece of paper and read a poem aloud. It had been written in 1904 by his grandfather, the Meiji Emperor, on the eve of the war with Russia. The poem asks why, when all the seas of the world are brothers to one another, the winds and waves should rise up in such turmoil. The room went silent. This was not done. Ministers and admirals sat in a formal chamber while the sovereign, who was supposed to be a silent presence, read them a poem about peace. Nagano and the others took the meaning. They said the correct things about the government preferring diplomacy. The decision stood. Preparations continued. On October 16, 1941, Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro resigned. 50 years old, an aristocrat of the highest blood, he had spent months looking for an exit that did not require him to confront the army directly. He never found one, and he was not really looking hard enough to find one. He resigned instead. On October 17, the emperor commissioned Tojo Hideki to form a government. The following day, October 18, 1941, Tojo became prime minister, while retaining the war ministry and taking the home ministry as well. The army minister, who had told a room full of researchers that their numbers did not account for the unquantifiable, now held the government, the army, and the police. The plan for Pearl Harbor was Yamamoto's. Understand how strange that is. The man who had told the prime minister he had no confidence in a long war designed the operation that started one. He did not do it because he had changed his mind. He did it because he had not. His reasoning ran like this: Japan cannot win a long war. Therefore, Japan must not fight one. Therefore, the only version of this war with any chance at all is one where the American Pacific Fleet is destroyed in a single stroke, so that the United States cannot interfere with the seizure of the southern resource areas, and so that American opinion, faced with a catastrophe and a fait accompli, accepts a negotiated settlement. It was not a strategy for victory. It was a strategy for making victory unnecessary. The naval staff hated it. It was reckless. It risked the empire's carriers thousands of miles from home, and it cut against Japan's long-standing doctrine of waiting for the American fleet to come west and destroying it in one decisive battle near home water. Yamamoto threatened to resign. He got his operation. On November 26, 1941, a task force under Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi weighed anchor in Hitokapu Bay, in the Kurili Islands, in the freezing far north. 6 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, tankers. They went east across the empty northern Pacific under radio silence, in weather bad enough that men were lost overboard. On December 7, 1941, Hawaii time, they launched. You know what happened. 2 waves, roughly 350 aircraft, battleship row broken, Arizona gone in a magazine explosion. More than 2,400 Americans killed. Japanese losses, 29 aircraft. Tactically, one of the most successful naval air operations ever conducted. Strategically, it left the essential work undone. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. The tank farms holding the fleet's fuel oil were not attacked. The repair facilities and dry docks that would put damaged ships back to sea were not attacked. Every battleship sunk in that shallow harbor except Arizona and Oklahoma would eventually be raised and returned to service. And there is a footnote here that belongs in a story with this title. For decades, the standard account held that a third strike was proposed on the day to destroy the fuel and repair infrastructure, and that Nagumo timidly refused. That account rests very heavily on the post-war testimony of one officer, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who led the air attack. And Fuchida's reliability as a witness has been seriously challenged by later research, with several of his best-known claims failing to match the documentary record. The story we tell about Pearl Harbor has been shaped for 80 years, partly by a narrator whose accuracy is now in doubt. Hold on to that, it is going to keep happening. Yamamoto himself does not appear to have celebrated. He had bought time, that was all the operation could ever buy. And he knew with more precision than nearly any other senior officer in Japan, roughly how much time he had bought. 6 months, maybe a year. He had said so on the record 15 months earlier. And then for about 90 days, everything Tsuji Masanobu had written appeared to be correct. That is the part that makes this story dangerous. Not that the propaganda was wrong, that it seemed at first to be right. Japanese landings hit the Malayan coast in the first hours of the war. The 25th Army, under Lieutenant General Yamashita Tomoyuki, 56, began driving south down the peninsula towards Singapore, the great British naval fortress, the anchor of European power in Southeast Asia, the place the British had spent 20 years and a fortune making impregnable. Tsuji was the 25th Army's senior operations staff officer. His fingerprints are on the campaign's design, and the design was good. Japanese troops moved fast and light. They used bicycles, thousands of them, to move down roads the British had assumed would channel any advance into predictable killing grounds. When they hit a defended position, they did not batter it. They went around it, through plantation and swamp the defenders had written off as impassable, and appeared behind it. On December 10, 1941, off the Malayan coast, Japanese naval aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse in open water. 2 capital ships underway at sea, sunk by aircraft. There is a moment in military history where an era ends, and that was one of them. By the end of January, the British had been pushed off the peninsula entirely and onto Singapore Island. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered. Roughly 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops went into captivity that day. Across the whole Malayan campaign, the number captured runs to something on the order of 130,000. Yamashita's force had been substantially outnumbered throughout. Now imagine you are a 20-year-old Japanese private who read that booklet in the hold of a transport 8 weeks ago. It told you the Westerner was soft. You have just watched an empire fold in 70 days. It told you he would not fight in the rain and the dark. You have fought in the rain and the dark and won. It told you he was fat on colonial labor and had lost the capacity to endure. You have watched him surrender in numbers that beggar belief. The booklet was not propaganda anymore. It was a field manual that had been validated by results, and here is the mechanism that is going to damage the Japanese army beyond repair. A false belief that produces failure gets corrected. A false belief that produces spectacular, undeniable, empire-shaking success does not get corrected. It gets promoted. But look closer at why Malaya worked, because Tsuji never did, and that failure is the hinge of everything that follows. Malaya was won with logistics on Tsuji's side. There were roads down that peninsula, and the British had built them. There were bicycles and rubber plantations to ride through, and supply lines that ran back along a coast Japan controlled. The distances were short. The enemy was scattered, poorly led at the top, and stunned. The Japanese soldier in Malaya was often better supplied than the man he was fighting, and he was fed. Tsuji Masanobu looked at that victory and drew a different lesson from it. He concluded that Japanese spirit had overcome British material. He concluded that the theory in his booklet had been proven under fire. He was about to carry that conclusion to an island with no roads, no bicycles, and a supply line 1,500 miles long across water the enemy controlled by day. His greatest triumph had taught him the wrong thing. In the same weeks that Yamashita and Tsuji were driving down Malaya, a separate Japanese force landed on the coast of British Borneo. It was called the Kawaguchi Detachment after its commander, Major General Kawaguchi Kiyotake. He was 49, a career infantry officer, a graduate of the military academy and the staff college, and by the standards of the Imperial Japanese Army, an unremarkable man. That last part matters. Kawaguchi is not the hero of this story. He was a professional soldier serving an expansionist empire in a war of aggression, and he carried out his orders competently. He is not being offered to you as a good man. He is being offered to you as a data point. Because Kawaguchi had one characteristic his army struggled to process. He said what he actually thought, and he wrote it down. His detachment took the oil town of Miri in mid-December and Kuching on Christmas Eve. Efficient, professional operation. Then his force was redirected to the southern Philippines, and there in the spring of 1942 Kawaguchi ran into the machine. His troops captured Jose Abad Santos, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines, a civilian jurist who had refused to collaborate. An order came down that he was to be executed. By the Japanese accounts that survive, Kawaguchi argued against it. He believed executing a senior civilian judge was both wrong and counterproductive, that it would harden Filipino opinion against the occupation for no operational gain. He tried to get the order reversed. He was overruled. Abad Santos was executed on May 2, 1942, by other hands. Kawaguchi did not stop the killing. He lacked the power and possibly the will to do more than object through channels. Do not romanticize what he did, but note what he did and note what happens next. He had now been recorded in the files of an army in the middle of an unbroken run of victories as an officer who raised objections, who questioned, who put doubt on paper. 3 facts then before we leave 1941 behind. The Japanese government commissioned a rigorous simulation of a war against the United States and was told it would lose. The commander-in-chief of its combined fleet said a year in advance that he had no confidence in a prolonged war. And the document that taught the Japanese soldier to despise the American opens with the image of a man being strangled with a silk cord. That is not an empire that had never thought about America. That is an empire that had thought about America very carefully, did not like what it saw, and could not say so out loud. So it printed a story instead, and handed it to boys in the holds of ships, and for 10 glorious weeks the world appeared to confirm it. Then the story went to a jungle island called Guadalcanal, and there it began to kill the people who believed it. There is a river on the north coast of that island. In August of 1942, the American Marines holding the ground east of the airfield called it the Tanaru, though their maps were wrong and the water in front of them was actually a stream called the Ilu. It hardly mattered. What mattered was the sandbar. The stream met the sea and did not quite reach it. Sand had built up across the mouth over years of tide and current, forming a bar perhaps 30 yards wide. It was the only place a man could cross without swimming. On the American side of that sandbar, the Marines had spent 2 weeks digging. Barbed wire, machine guns registered on fixed lines, a 37mm anti-tank gun, riflemen in holes. Mortars ranged behind them. They were exhausted, half-fed, and many of them had dysentery, but they were dug in and they had been waiting. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning on August 21, 1942, roughly 800 Japanese soldiers came across that sandbar at a dead run. They were the first echelon of the Ichiki detachment, and the officer who sent them was Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao, the same Ichiki who had been on the ground at a stone bridge outside Peking on a July night 5 years before, when a lost soldier and a few shots in the dark became a war that never ended. 5 years and 4,000 miles, and here he was again, at another crossing point in the dark, making another decision he had no business making. His men were good, some of the best light infantry in the Japanese army, trained, disciplined, veterans of China. They came across the sand in the dark, and they came into the wire, and the wire held them there, the machine guns open. And when the attackers bunched on the sandbar, unable to go forward through the wire and unwilling to go back, the 37mm gun fired canister into them, a shell that turns a field piece into an enormous shotgun. You do not need the details, you need the number. Colonel Ichiki brought roughly 900 men to that river. By full daylight, fewer than 130 of them were still alive and able to move. American losses came to somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 killed. Ichiki himself died on Guadalcanal in the hours that followed. Whether by his own hand or by American fire, the record does not settle now. Everything this story is going to argue depends on you understanding why that happened, and the popular answer is wrong. The popular answer is fanaticism. The popular answer is that Japanese soldiers charged machine guns because they had been raised to believe death was glory and life was cheap, and that this is simply what they did. That is not what happened at the Tanaru. What happened at the Tanaru was an intelligence failure, and then something worse than an intelligence failure. Roll the clock back 13 days. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division struck Guadalcanal and the nearby Tulagi Gavutu Tanambogo complex across the channel. The operation put close to 20,000 Marines against those objectives. By the evening of August 8th, roughly 11,000 of them were ashore on Guadalcanal itself, with about 6,000 more in the Tulagi sector. They came for one reason. The Japanese were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal. An airstrip there put bombers within reach of the sea lanes to Australia, and if those lanes closed, the entire Allied position in the South Pacific closed with them. The Marines took the unfinished strip on the second day. They named it Henderson Field after a Marine dive bomber pilot killed at Midway. Then the American carriers withdrew. The supply ships pulled out early after a savage night battle off Savo Island, and those 11,000 Marines were left on that beachhead with about a third of their supplies, no air cover worth the name, and no way home. That was the situation on the ground. Here is what Japanese headquarters at Rabaul believed the situation to be. They believed the American force numbered around 2,000 men. They believed it was a raiding party, a nuisance operation, put ashore to wreck the airstrip and then withdraw. Some of the staff believed the Americans might already be pulling out. 2,000 believed. 11,000 actually there. Where did that number come from? From thin reconnaissance, from fragmentary reports, from an aerial picture that could not see men under palm trees, and from a headquarters that had spent 9 months being right about everything and had lost the habit of doubting itself. So the 17th Army was ordered to retake the airfield. The nearest available formation was Ichiki's, and Ichiki was told to move fast. His detachment numbered roughly 2,000 men in total, split into echelons, an assault group of about 900, with the remainder following in slow transports. He was told in effect that the enemy was weak and that speed mattered more than mass, and Ichiki Kiyonao did not wait. He could have waited. His follow-on echelon was days away. His orders left him room. He chose to attack immediately with only his roughly 900-man first echelon, before the rest of the detachment arrived, across the only crossing his enemy had bothered to fortify. Understand the two layers here because this is the hinge of the entire story. Layer 1 is the bad number. That is an intelligence failure, and every army in history has made them. The Americans would make an enormous one about Kyushu in 1945. Intelligence failures alone do not lose wars. Layer 2 is why the bad number went unchallenged. Because everyone in that chain, from Rabaul down to the sandbar, had been reading the same story for 8 months. The story said the Westerner was soft. The story said he would not stand. The story said he would break and run when pressed hard by men with spirit. An estimate that says the enemy is weak does not get questioned in an army that already believes the enemy is weak. The propaganda did not order that attack. The propaganda made that attack harder to argue against. That distinction is the difference between a war story and a true story, and this account is going to hold it all the way to the end. The Japanese response to the Tenaru was not to reconsider. It was to send more men. In late August and early September, destroyers began running down the slot between the islands at night, fast, dark, unloading troops on the beaches before dawn and racing back out of air range. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese commander running those trips, Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo, 50 years old, disliked the arrangement and said so. Destroyers were not cargo ships. Every run cost fuel, cost sleep, cost risk, and delivered a fraction of what the men ashore needed. By early September, roughly 6,000 Japanese troops were on Guadalcanal under Major General Kawaguchi Kiyotake, the same officer who had objected to an execution in the Philippines 4 months earlier and been overruled. Kawaguchi walked his men into the jungle south of the airfield. Stop there for a moment because the maps flatten this and the maps lie. That jungle was not the jungle of a film set. It was steep ridge and ravine, tangled second growth, roots you could not see, mud you sank into, and heat that did not fall at night. There were no roads. There were no trails worth the name. Men carried their own ammunition, their own rice, and the components of mountain guns broken down on their backs. The march to the attack position took days. The columns lost cohesion. Units arrived at different times, in different places, in the dark, without radios that worked in that terrain. And on the nights of September 12th through 14th, 1942, Kawaguchi's force attacked a low, bare-backed ridge that ran down toward Henderson Field from the south. The Americans held it with Marine raiders and parachutists under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, 45 years old, a lean, gray-eyed, profoundly cold-blooded professional. The ridge would end up carrying his name. 2 nights of fighting at a range measured in yards. Marine artillery firing so close to the front line that the gun crews could hear their own shells landing on the hillside ahead. Positions overrun and retaken. Edson's line bent back until it was a few hundred yards from the airfield and did not break. Kawaguchi lost something on the order of 800 men killed. The attack failed completely. And then Kawaguchi did the thing that would end his career. He wrote down what had actually happened. His assessment said the following in substance. The enemy on Guadalcanal was not a raiding party. He was present in strength. He was dug in, he had artillery, and he had not broken under a night attack pressed home at close quarters. The terrain south of the airfield made coordinated attack nearly impossible. Units could not arrive together, communications did not function, heavy weapons could not be brought forward in useful numbers, and the supply situation was already failing. Men were arriving hungry and fighting hungrier. Every line of that was accurate. All of it would be confirmed at enormous cost over the following 4 months. Now think about what that report was inside the Imperial Japanese Army in September of 1942. It was a document saying, "The assumptions are wrong. Not we were unlucky. Not the men lacked spirit." It said the enemy is stronger than we were told, the ground is worse than we were told, and the plan cannot work. An army that could absorb that report would have adjusted. It would have massed properly, waited for artillery, secured a supply line, and either fought a real campaign or cut its losses. The Imperial Japanese Army in 1942 did not absorb it because it did not merely criticize a plan. It cut against the story, the one printed in that booklet and carried south in those transports. The story that said the enemy was soft and that spirit closed the gap between an empire without oil and an empire with all of it. If Kawaguchi was right about Guadalcanal, then the booklet was wrong. And if the booklet was wrong, then the men in Tokyo who had shelved a report in August of 1941 had been wrong to shelve. That is a difficult thought to let into a building. In late September of 1942, a colonel from Imperial General Headquarters came down to Guadalcanal to assess the situation personally. Tsuji Masanobu, weeks away from his 40th birthday, the author of Read This Alone and The War Can Be Won, the man who had written in print for distribution to fighting troops that the Western soldier was effeminate and cowardly and disliked fighting in rain, in mist, or at night. And now he was standing on an island where the Western soldier had just fought for 3 nights in the rain, in the mist, in the dark, and held. Understand what Tsuji was, institutionally. He was a staff officer. He commanded nothing. He had no authority to issue an order to a single soldier on that island. In the formal structure of the Japanese army, Kawaguchi outranked him in every way that was supposed to matter, and that mattered less than it should have, because Tsuji had perfected a method. He arrived speaking with the voice of Imperial General Headquarters. He implied that Tokyo's confidence rested on his shoulders and that his assessment would decide reputations. He was tireless, articulate, and utterly certain. And this is the part that made him dangerous. He was willing to frame disagreement as a question of character. Not, your analysis is incorrect, but your spirit is insufficient. In an army whose self-understanding rested on the claim that spirit overcomes material, that accusation was nearly unanswerable. You cannot produce evidence of your own fighting spirit. You can only demonstrate it by attacking. So picture the two of them, somewhere in the palms behind the beach, in the heat, mosquitoes in the lamplight, the smell of a jungle latrine and rotting canvas. One man has marched 6,000 troops through that terrain and watched 800 of them die on a bare ridge. The other has been on the island for days and has written a book about how the enemy is a coward. Japanese strength on Guadalcanal grew through October. The 2nd Division came in under Lieutenant General Maruyama Masao. By the 3rd week of the month, Lieutenant General Hyakutake Harukichi, 54, commanding the 17th Army, had something over 20,000 troops on the island and a plan to take Henderson Field once and for all. A large force would swing wide through the jungle to the south, exactly as Kawaguchi's men had done, and hit the American perimeter from the interior while other forces attacked from the west along the coast. Kawaguchi was given the right wing of the southern attack, and Kawaguchi had already fought over this ground once. He believed the assigned axis repeated the mistake of September. He began shifting his right wing farther east toward ground he considered more favorable. Maruyama ordered him back onto the original axis. Kawaguchi refused. On October 23, 1942, he was relieved and replaced by Colonel Shoji Toshinari. Kawaguchi later believed Tsuji had worked against him in that dispute. The surviving accounts do not allow us to reduce the episode to one clean motive, and this story is not going to pretend otherwise. But the result is beyond dispute. On the eve of the largest Japanese ground offensive yet attempted on Guadalcanal, the general with the freshest first-hand experience of that southern terrain was removed from the attack. What followed on the nights of October 24th and 25th broke on the same problems he had already lived through. The southern force arrived late and disorganized after days in the jungle. Coordination between the southern and western attacks collapsed. Regiments went in piecemeal at night against a prepared American line. At one point on that perimeter, a Marine machine gun section under Sergeant John Basilone, 25 years old, held a sector through the night as Japanese infantry came against it repeatedly in the dark and the rain. And here this story is going to be honest with you, because you have heard this kind of moment described 1,000 times, and it has usually been described dishonestly. What held that line was not superior courage. The men attacking it were not cowards. They had walked for days on empty stomachs to get there, and they went forward into fire that they must have known would kill most of them. What held that line was interlocking machine gun fire, pre-registered artillery, barbed wire, ammunition resupply that functioned, and a defensive plan thought through in daylight by men who had eaten. The Japanese had spirit. The Americans had logistics. By October 26, the offensive was finished. Japanese losses in that operation ran somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 killed. Henderson Field had not been taken, and it never would be. The 17th Army had now failed 3 times. At the river in August with 900 men. On the ridge in September with 6,000. On the perimeter in October with 20,000. Each time the answer had been more men. Each time the men had arrived hungrier than the last. And now the island was about to do to the Imperial Japanese Army something no American Marine had managed. The soldiers on Guadalcanal gave the island a new name. Its Japanese rendering was Guadalcanal. They shortened it and changed the character, and what they called it was WW2. Starvation Island. Here is how that happened, and I want to give it to you the way the men in Tokyo would have seen it, as numbers, because the numbers are the story, and because the numbers are what nobody wanted to look at. Start with one man. A Japanese soldier in the field required somewhere in the region of 600 grams of rice a day as his standard ration, call it a pound and a third, plus whatever else the supply system could add. Not comfortable, functional. Now multiply by 20,000 men. Then by 30 days. You are looking at hundreds of tons of rice a month, and that is only the rice. It does not include ammunition, medicine, fuel, spare parts, or the shells for the artillery you would need to actually take the airfield. Now ask how it gets there. It cannot come by cargo ship. American aircraft flying from Henderson Field owned the daylight, and a slow transport in daylight was a target that could not be missed. Several were caught trying and burned. So it came by destroyer at night at high speed, and a destroyer is not a freighter. It is a thin steel spear built for speed and torpedoes with almost no cargo space. Loading it with rice meant stripping out equipment and cramming sacks into passageways. And then Tanaka's crews had to unload it on an open beach in the dark in under an hour and be out of air range before dawn. They could not do it fast enough, so somebody in the supply staff had an idea. Seal the rice into steel drums, chain the drums together, push them over the side offshore, let the current carry them in, and have the troops on the beach swim out and haul them ashore. It sounds clever. It was desperate. Drums drifted past the landing points and out to sea. Drums took on water and sank. Drums that made it ashore were shot up by aircraft at first light. On some runs, only a small fraction of what went into the water was ever recovered. Tanaka, who had commanded a destroyer squadron in real combat and knew exactly what his ships were designed to do, protested the whole arrangement. He was in time removed from his command. There it is again, the same shape. The professional who reports the physical reality gets moved out of the way. So go back down to the ground and look at what those numbers meant to a man standing on that island in December of 1942. The ration collapsed, then it collapsed again. Men were subsisting on a small handful of rice a day, then on less than that, then on whatever could be found. Roots, grass, bark, coconut where it could be reached. And the island had malaria and dengue and dysentery, and nearly every man was carrying at least one of them. There was a rule of thumb that circulated among the troops for estimating how long a man had left. Its exact origin is not documented, but versions of it appear consistently in accounts of the campaign. A man who could still stand had perhaps 30 days. A man who could sit up but not stand had about 3 weeks. A man who could not sit up had a week. A man who could no longer speak, less than that. Nobody handed that scale out in a booklet. It was written by the island itself. Now the total. Between August of 1942 and February of 1943, the Japanese army lost somewhere in the range of 19,000 to 25,000 men on Guadalcanal. Estimates of how many of those deaths came from combat and how many from starvation and disease vary between historians. But the consistent finding, the thing every serious study agrees on, is that the fighting was not the whole of it, and by many accounts not even the largest part. Read that again. The force that destroyed the Japanese army on Guadalcanal was not only the American Marines. It was the supply line, it was tonnage, it was distance. It was the fact that an empire without oil had projected an army 1,500 miles beyond its own logistics, and then struggled for 6 months to hear what its own officers were telling it. Every one of those factors had been named, in writing, in Tokyo, in August of 1941, by 35 young researchers who ran a simulation and concluded that the merchant fleet would fail and the empire would come apart from the inside. They had been told it was a desk exercise. Guadalcanal was the desk exercise, walking. American Marines on Guadalcanal collected paper, diaries, maps, orders, letters. Anything taken from a Japanese position went back for translation. And among the material of that campaign was a letter written by a Japanese soldier on that island that has been quoted in American accounts ever since. I am going to describe it rather than quote it, and you will see why in a moment. The writer told his family that the enemy on Guadalcanal was not ordinary troops. That these were Marines, a special force, he said, and here is the claim, recruited out of prisons and asylums specifically for their appetite for killing. He wrote that they did not take prisoners in any honorable sense, and he described mutilations and executions of captured men in terms designed to make a reader's skin crawl. Now let us be precise about what that document is and what it is not. It is not a report of things the writer witnessed. It is a rumor. It is the kind of thing that circulates through a starving army in the dark, passed from man to man, growing with each telling. The specific claim that the American Marine Corps recruited from jails and mental institutions is false. The Corps took volunteers, and in 1942 it had more of them than it could process. But look at what that letter tells you about the writer. Months earlier, his army handed him a pamphlet explaining that the American was effeminate, cowardly, and unwilling to fight in the rain. Now he is on Gay-2. He has been fighting that American for months. His friends are dying, mostly not from bullets, and he is trying to reconcile the enemy he was promised with the enemy in front of him. He cannot easily say we were lied to. That thought had no comfortable home in his army. The officer who came closest to writing it down had just lost his command. So he does the only other thing available. He upgrades the enemy into a monster, not a better soldier, not a better supplied soldier, a criminal, a lunatic, something inhuman that fights well because it is not really a man. That letter is not evidence about the American Marines. It is a photograph of the moment a soldier's propaganda stops working and has to be replaced with something more frightening in order to keep his world coherent. The contempt is gone from that page. What has taken its place is fear, wearing a costume. And now we come to the hardest part of this story. And I am going to walk through it carefully, because it would be very easy to do it badly. The claim in that letter was false when it was written, and over the years that followed, on other islands, things happened that made it less false than it should have been. Here is what the record shows. American forces in the Pacific sometimes did not take prisoners when prisoners could have been taken. This is not a fringe claim. It appears in the memoirs of the men who were there and in the work of serious historians. The Australian correspondent Dennis Warner, who was in his 20s during the war and covered the Bougainville campaign, recorded an incident in which a senior American officer ordered wounded Japanese soldiers who were attempting to surrender to be shot. The American Marine William Manchester, who was 23 at Okinawa in 1945 and later became one of the finest historians of his generation, wrote in his 1980 memoir about watching a young American soldier open fire with a submachine gun on a line of unarmed Japanese soldiers who had already surrendered, and there was the trophy taking. American troops in the Pacific took souvenirs from Japanese dead. It happened often enough to be photographed, often enough to appear in mainstream American magazines, and often enough that the United States military issued formal orders against it in 1944, which is not something armies do about problems that are not occurring. I am not going to describe any of it in detail. You do not need the detail, and the detail is not the point. The point is the mechanism, because if you stand far enough back, what you are looking at is two propaganda systems feeding each other. The Japanese soldier was told the American was a subhuman coward, and some acted accordingly, and Japanese treatment of prisoners, from Bataan onward, gave American troops every reason to believe that surrendering to the Japanese army meant death. The American soldier heard about Bataan, and heard about wounded men being killed, and heard about surrenders used as ambushes, and he stopped taking chances, and every American who fired on a man with his hands up handed the Japanese propagandists their next pamphlet. Each side built a story about the other. Then each side, by its own conduct, made the other side's story look like reporting. That is what a war of this kind does. It is not that both sides were the same. They were not, and the empire that started this in China in 1937 does not get to hide behind an equivalence. It is that atrocity is a conversation, and both parties were speaking. And on that same island, in that same period, in the middle of that conversation, one American did the opposite of everything I have just described. Sherwood Moran was 57 years old when he went to Guadalcanal in the uniform of the American Marines, as an interpreter, 57. He had spent a quarter century in the country his own nation was now fighting, and he had come home with the only asset that mattered in that tent. He could talk to these people. Picture him there. An Ohio missionary in his late 50s in a war of 20-year-olds, on an island where his own side had every reason on earth to hate the men he was about to sit down with. And what he did in that tent was, by the standards of 1943, close to unthinkable. He did not threaten them. He did not raise his voice, or make them stand, or leave them without water, or use the small cruelties that interrogators everywhere have long believed to be the tools of the trade. He asked about their wounds. He asked whether they were in pain. He arranged for their injuries to be treated. He spoke to them in fluent, warm, colloquial Japanese. The Japanese of neighbors, not of officials, and when he sat down, he made a point of sitting at the same level as the prisoner, or lower. In July of 1943, he wrote it down. A memorandum on the interrogation of Japanese prisoners, laying out his approach in plain language for the interpreters coming into the theater behind him. His argument was not sentimental, it was operational. He wrote that the interrogator's first task was to establish, immediately and completely, that he was one human being talking to another. That the prisoner's mind was not a safe to be cracked but a door that opened from the inside. That coercion produced silence, or produced whatever the prisoner thought you wanted to hear, which was worse than silence. That memorandum became an enduring intelligence document, and Moran's methods were later taught at the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And here is why the approach worked as well as it did. It worked because of a gap in the Japanese Army's doctrine that few people in Tokyo had ever thought about. Step back from the island now. Rise up until you can see the whole ocean, because there is a war going on out here that has no ridgelines and no correspondence and almost no photographs, and it is the war that does most to decide the outcome. Japan is an island empire. Every ton of oil from Borneo, every ton of rubber from Malaya, every ton of iron ore, every ton of rice, every reinforcement, every artillery shell moves by ship. Cut the ships and the empire does not lose a battle. The empire stops. American submarines went after those ships. The campaign started badly, and it started badly for a reason that will infuriate any man who has ever been let down by equipment he was told to trust. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard American submarine weapon, had 3 infamous interacting defects, and they were diagnosed and fixed one at a time over roughly 18 months, while crews took boats into harm's way and came home with nothing. The first was depth control. The torpedoes ran significantly deeper than set, passing harmlessly under their targets. That was confirmed in the summer of 1942. The second was the magnetic exploder, which was supposed to detonate the warhead under a ship's keel and instead fired early or not at all. It was ordered deactivated in the Pacific in mid-1943. The third was the contact exploder itself, which, and this is almost too cruel to be true, failed most often when the torpedo struck the target squarely at a perfect 90 degrees. The best shot was the least likely to explode. That was diagnosed and corrected in the autumn of 1943, and it carried a fourth danger that was never entirely eliminated: circular running. A torpedo could turn back on the submarine that fired it. Submarine captains reported all of it. For a long time, the Bureau of Ordnance told them they were missing. Once those problems were fixed, the arithmetic became merciless. Over the course of the war, American submarines sank roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost. They did it while making up a tiny fraction of American naval personnel. And they did it to a merchant fleet Japan could not replace, because replacing it required steel, and steel required ore, and ore arrived by ship. Now the question that matters: did the Japanese know? Of course they knew. They were the ones counting the ships that did not come back, so what did they do about it? Japan did not establish a dedicated command for protecting its own shipping, the Grand Escort Command Headquarters, until November 15, 1943, 2 years into the war. 2 years of watching tankers disappear before the Navy created an organization whose entire purpose was to stop tankers from disappearing. And even then it was starved. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built, trained, and philosophically shaped around one idea: the decisive fleet battle. Battleships and carriers meeting the enemy's battleships and carriers and settling the war in an afternoon. Convoy escort was not glorious. It got the second-rate ships, the old destroyers, the crews nobody fought over. Why so slow? Because taking the shipping war seriously meant conceding that the decisive battle doctrine was not the war they were actually in. And conceding that meant admitting that the premise of the whole conflict, something short and sharp, finished before American industry got moving, had been wrong from the first day. That is a hard concession for any institution. It is nearly impossible for one that has learned to treat correction as weakness. Kawaguchi could have told them that. There was one more thing the ocean took, and it took it on a date nobody in Tokyo could have chosen. On April 18, 1943, with American codebreakers having read his itinerary, a flight of long-range P-38 Lightnings intercepted the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku over Bougainville. The aircraft came down in the jungle. Yamamoto was 59 years old. His death was not announced in Japan until the 21st of May. Now look at the date of the interception. April 18, 1943 was exactly 1 year, to the day after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched 16 B-25s off the deck of the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The raid that did minimal physical damage and told the Japanese High Command something it could not absorb, which was that the sky above the Emperor could be entered. 1 year to the day. The man who had spoken of 6 months or a year died a little more than 16 months into the war he had warned against, planned anyway, and said in writing he had no confidence in winning. Many Western armies treated capture as a possibility soldiers had to be prepared for. You are told what you are obliged to give: name, rank, number. You are told what you are forbidden to give. You are told the enemy will lie to you, isolate you, pretend to know more than he does. You are told above all that being a prisoner is a temporary condition and that you remain a soldier while you are in it. The Imperial Japanese Army built its doctrine around a radically different assumption. Capture itself was disgrace. The Field Service Code issued in 1941 told the Japanese soldier, in language every conscript memorized, that he must not live to suffer the shame of being taken prisoner, not should avoid, must not live. That stigma was reinforced so powerfully and so consistently that Japanese soldiers received remarkably little practical security guidance for what to do once capture had actually happened. If the outcome is unthinkable, you do not write a chapter about it. If there is no chapter, there is no name, rank, and number rule, no list of what may be said and what may not. Now put a real man in that gap. He's 22. He has been on an island for 4 months. He weighs perhaps 95 pounds. He has malaria and dysentery and a wound that has gone bad in the heat. At some point he lost consciousness, and when he came back he was on a stretcher, under a canvas roof, with a tube in his arm and a stranger checking his pulse. He is alive, and according to nearly everything he was ever taught, that is the one thing he was not supposed to be. He is not a prisoner of war in any category his army recognized. He is not a soldier anymore. He fears that news of his capture would destroy his family standing in their town. In the moral framework he was handed, he is already gone, and worse than gone, because the dead at least keep their honor. And then an American in his late 50s sits down beside him, speaks to him in the Japanese of his own childhood, and asks whether his wounds are hurting. What is he holding back? For whom? Under what rule? Allied interrogators eventually discovered the consequence. Across the Pacific, they found the same thing again and again. Japanese prisoners, men from the army the world believed to be the most fanatical on earth, frequently talked with a completeness that stunned the men questioning. Unit designations, strengths, officers' names, supply dumps, morale, positions. Sometimes they volunteered information nobody had thought to ask for. Sometimes they offered to write out orders of battle from memory or help translate captured documents. There was little calculation of betrayal in it, because betrayal requires that you still believe you belong to something. The army that was so hard to defeat in the field, because its men would not surrender, turned out to be, once its men had been taken alive, one of the most forthcoming armies of the entire war. The doctrine that produced the fanatic produced the leak, and the leak was in exactly the place the doctrine had told everyone to stop looking, which brings us to a man who was almost too old to be there, and far too educated to make sense of what happened to him. His name was Oka Shohei. He was born in Tokyo in 1909, which made him 35 when the great manpower sweeps began pulling in men the army had previously passed over. He was a writer and a translator. His specialty was French literature, Stendhal in particular. He had spent his adult life in books, among authors who wrote about ambition and love and the terrible gap between how a man imagines himself and how he behaves when the moment arrives. In March of 1944, with a family at home, he was conscripted. He had almost no military training. He was given a few months of it, handed a rifle, and shipped to the Philippines, to the island of Mindoro, into a garrison that was, by any professional assessment, ornamental, undersupplied, underarmed, positioned to be overrun. By January of 1945, the Americans were landing. The Japanese units on Mindoro had disintegrated, and Oka was in the mountains with malaria, moving with the remnants of his company, and then, eventually, alone. On January 25, 1945, he was found unconscious by American troops and taken alive. He survived. He was sent to a prison camp on Leyte. He came home after the war, and he sat down and wrote about it, first in a book that appeared in English as Taken Captive, and later in the novel Fires on the Plain, which is one of the very few works produced by any combatant nation that looks directly at what war does to a man's insides and refuses to look away. And in that first book he described the moment he would spend the rest of his life failing to explain. He was in the hills, sick, half-starved, essentially alone, and an American soldier came into view. Young, close, unaware. Oka had a rifle. He was a Japanese soldier in a war zone. The man in front of him was the enemy. The enemy was in his sights, and there was no one else present to see what he did next. He did not fire. He let the man walk on. Now here is what makes Oka Shohei one of the most valuable witnesses of the entire Pacific War. He did not do what almost every memoirist in history does with a moment like that. He did not make it noble. He went back over it for years as a professional writer with a trained analytical mind, and he refused the flattering explanations. Was it mercy? He could not confirm it. Was it the humanism of a man who had spent his life reading French novels? He did not trust that answer either. Was it exhaustion or fever or the simple physical inertia of a body that had stopped wanting to do anything at all? Possibly. He could not rule it out. He would not rule it out. What he arrived at, after all that examination, was closer to an admission than a conclusion, that in the decisive moment he did not know why he did what he did, and that a man's actions in war may not come from his beliefs at all. Think about what that means. Everything this story has been about, the booklet, the propaganda, the code, the doctrine, the training, the printed conviction that the enemy was a coward and that the soldier must not live to be taken. All of that machinery rested on one assumption: that you can install a belief in a man, and the belief will decide what he does. And here is a Japanese soldier alone on a mountainside, with the enemy in his sights and the whole apparatus of the imperial state loaded into his head, and the apparatus simply did not fire. Oka never claimed to be better than the war. He only reported accurately that in the moment that mattered, the war did not own him. That is what the empire could never account for. Not resistance, not heroism, just the ordinary, unmanageable interior of a human being, the one thing no field service code has ever successfully legislated. While Oka was in training, the war reached a place that would end the men who started it. In September of 1943, Imperial General Headquarters had drawn a line on a map. They called it the Absolute National Defense Zone, the perimeter inside which the empire had to hold to keep its industry supplied and its home islands out of range. The Mariana Islands were on that line. Saipan was the anchor. On June 15, 1944, American forces landed on Saipan. The battle ran 3 weeks and was among the most severe of the Pacific War. But the strategic verdict arrived the moment the beachhead held, and every officer in Tokyo who could read a chart understood it. Saipan lies roughly 1,300 miles from Tokyo. That was inside the operational reach of the B-29 superfortress. Barely, and at a cost in bomb load, and it would take months of work to make it routine, but inside. The Absolute National Defense Zone was not a line the Empire preferred to hold. It was the line beyond which the Japanese home islands could be bombed. On July 9, 1944, that line was gone. On July 18, 1944, the government of Tojo Hideki fell. Sit with that for a second. The man who had listened to 35 researchers explained that Japan would lose, and told them war contains elements that cannot be measured. That man was removed from power 33 months later by a measurement. Distance. Aircraft range, 1,300 miles. There is no elegant way to say it. The unquantifiable factor lost to a ruler and a map. But Saipan was not only a military problem for Tokyo, it was a moral catastrophe, and it was partly of Japan's own manufacture. Saipan had been under Japanese administration since the end of the First World War. By 1944, there was a substantial Japanese civilian population living there. Farmers, sugar workers, shopkeepers, teachers, families who had built lives on that island across a generation. And those civilians had been fed the same kind of story that had been printed in the booklet. The Japanese propaganda term for the enemy was Kichikubi. It translates as something like demonic beasts, American and British. For years during the Pacific War, and with increasing intensity from around 1943, as the news from the front worsened, Japanese propaganda pushed that image through newspapers, posters, school materials, and radio. What it told ordinary Japanese people was not that the Americans were formidable. It told them the Americans were not human, and that what awaited any Japanese civilian who fell into their hands was worse than anything that could be described. So when the fighting reached them, thousands of civilians did not go toward the Americans. They went into the hills, into caves, into the limestone at the northern end of the island, hungry and thirsty and frightened out of their minds by a story their own government had helped write. And here is what the Americans did. They brought up loudspeakers. They used Japanese-American interpreters, Nisei, men whose loyalty had been questioned by their own country, some of whom had family in American internment camps at that very moment, and put them on those loudspeakers, and had them call into the caves in fluent Japanese. Come out. You will not be harmed. There is water. There is food. There is medical care. Bring your children. They sent civilians who had already surrendered back into the hills to carry the same message in person, because a neighbor's voice carries where a loudspeaker cannot, and it worked. Many thousands of Japanese civilians came out of those hills. They were taken to a camp at Susupe on the flat ground on the island's western side. It was a rough place, tents and salvaged lumber, thin at first, overcrowded, run by a military government that had never planned for anything like it. Nobody should pretend it was comfortable, but there was water. There was food, there were doctors, families stayed together, schools were organized inside the wire, children were fed. And the great majority of the civilians who walked out of those hills lived through the war and went home. Now hold the whole thing in your hand at once. The Japanese state taught its own civilians that the Americans were demons who would destroy them. That teaching did not kill one single American. What it did was very nearly stop thousands of Japan's own citizens from walking down a hill toward food and water and a doctor. That is what this weapon was. A rifle with the barrel bent back on itself. Every round it fired went inward into the people who built it. It made the empire's enemies no weaker and its own citizens far more likely to die of fear. And the men in Tokyo in July of 1944, having just lost the island and the government, were about to reach for something more desperate still. In October of 1944, the Americans landed in the Philippines, and the Japanese Navy came out to fight the largest naval battle in history at Leyte Gulf. And on October 17, 1944, a vice admiral arrived in Manila to take over the First Air Fleet. Onishi Takajiro, 53 years old. A naval aviator from the very first generation of them, a hard-drinking, blunt, physically imposing man with a reputation for saying exactly what he thought to people who did not want to hear it. He had worked on the technical planning for the Pearl Harbor attack. He had also been, in 1941, among those who thought a war with the United States was a mistake. When he got to the Philippines, he found what was left of his air fleet. The figure that survives is around 40 operational aircraft. 40. Against the American carrier force approaching Leyte. Now let us be accurate about what happened next, because the popular version is wrong. Onishi Takajiro did not invent the suicide attack. The idea had been circulating in the Japanese Navy before he arrived. Officers had proposed it. Pilots, some very junior, had discussed it among themselves. There had been individual instances throughout the war of damaged aircraft being deliberately flown into targets. The concept was in the air, and it was in the air because the arithmetic had become impossible. A Japanese pilot in late 1944 had a fraction of the training hours of his American counterpart. Fuel shortages had gutted the flight schools. The veterans of 1941 and 1942 were largely gone. A green Japanese pilot attempting a conventional torpedo or dive-bombing run against a fully alerted American task force, with radar direction, massed anti-aircraft fire using proximity-fused shells, and Hellcats overhead, had a very small chance of hitting anything and a very small chance of coming home. What Onishi did was institutionalize it. He took an idea men had been discussing and made it an organized formation with a name, an order of battle, and a chain of command. He called it the Shinpu Special Attack Corps. The characters would later be read in the West as kamikaze. He met with the pilots of the 201st Air Group and put it to them. The accounts of that meeting describe an atmosphere that was not fanatical at all. It was quiet, and Lieutenant Seki Yukio was chosen to lead the Shikishima unit of that newly organized corps. He was 23 years old, a career officer, Naval Academy trained, a skilled pilot, precisely the kind of man the Navy could least afford to spend. He had been married a matter of months. He accepted. And then Seki said something to a Japanese war correspondent named Onoda Masashi, which, as the correspondent recalled it after the war, is one of the most important things anyone said in the Pacific War. He said Japan was finished if it was killing its best pilots this way. He said he was not going to his death for the emperor or for the empire. He was going for the woman he loved. And he said that if he were ordered to, he could put a bomb on a carrier's flight deck with a conventional attack and come back alive. There it is. In one breath, from the man the world would spend 80 years using as the ultimate symbol of Japanese fanaticism. We are finished if we are doing this. The kamikaze is remembered as the purest expression of a nation that did not fear death. It was, in the reported words of the man who flew the first organized mission, the moment his nation admitted it could no longer fight a normal war. The first sorties went out and failed to find suitable targets. Then, on October 25, 1944, off Samar, the Shikishima unit under Seki attacked American escort carriers. They struck the USS St. Lo. The impact started fires that reached ordnance stored on the hangar deck, and a series of explosions tore her open. She went down with heavy loss of American life. Seki Yukio did not come back. Neither did roughly 3,000 other Japanese airmen over the 10 months that followed, because once the formation existed, the formation had to be fed. Now the war came to the Japanese home islands. From Saipan and Tinian, the B-29s came. The high-altitude precision campaign that began in November of 1944 did not work well. The jet stream over Japan scattered the bomb patterns and cloud hid the targets. So in March of 1945, the American commander changed the method entirely. Low altitude at night with incendiaries against cities built largely of wood. On the night of March 9 and 10, 1945, in an operation called Meeting House, that method was applied to Tokyo. Roughly 16 square miles of the city burned. The commonly cited death toll is on the order of 100,000 people, and around 1 million were left without homes. Then Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, city after city through the spring and summer. But something had already happened in Japan before that first firestorm. And it is a part of this history that almost never gets told. The Japanese government had seen it coming. In the summer of 1944, after Saipan fell, when it became clear the cities would come within range, the government began an organized evacuation of schoolchildren out of the major urban areas. It was called Gakudo Sokai. Entire elementary school classes with their teachers were moved out of Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya and the other target cities and relocated into the countryside. They were billeted in Buddhist temples, in country inns, in village halls, in whatever rural buildings could be found. Where families had relatives in the countryside, children were sent to them. Where they did not, the schools moved as units, It was a national program, and it moved children on an enormous scale. It was not a happy one. Children were separated from their parents, sometimes for a year or more. Food in the countryside was short too, and letters home were censored. And the teachers who went with them carried a weight nobody had trained them for. But it is one of the clearest examples of late war foresight the Japanese government produced, and it worked as intended. When the incendiaries came down on the wooden cities in 1945, an enormous number of Japan's children were not in them. They were in temples in the mountains, and in farm villages, and in the countryside where their teachers had taken them. Hold that image, because it stands in a very particular relationship to everything else in this story. The same government that could not act on a report about tanker tonnage in 1941, the same government that removed a general who challenged an attack plan he had already tested with his own boots, that government looked at a map in 1944, understood exactly what was coming, and moved the children out of the way. Again and again, parts of the Japanese state could see the danger. The tragedy was not total blindness. It was the repeated failure to turn recognition into correction. The end came in 8 days. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and in the early hours of the 9th, a Soviet offensive mounted by forces numbering well over 1 million men crossed into Japanese-held Manchuria along a front of thousands of miles. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Japanese military, was broken apart in a matter of days. On August 9, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And now I have to do something most accounts of this war refuse to do. I have to tell you that historians do not agree on what actually ended. The traditional account is that the atomic bombs forced the surrender. It is the account most of us grew up with, and it has serious evidence behind it, including the emperor's own broadcast, which explicitly referenced a new and most cruel bomb. But there is a substantial body of scholarship associated most prominently with the historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, arguing that the Soviet entry was the decisive shot. The reasoning runs like this. Japan had been enduring the destruction of its cities for 5 months without surrendering, and Tokyo had been quietly hoping the Soviet Union, still neutral until August, might broker a negotiated peace. When the Soviets attacked instead, the last diplomatic option in the world vanished overnight. And there are historians, notably Richard Frank, who argue forcefully for the bomb's decisiveness and against that reading, drawing on Japanese records and intercepted communication. I am not going to tell you which of them is right. I am going to tell you that the argument is real, that it is conducted by serious people using Japanese primary sources, and that anyone who hands you a simple, confident answer on this question is selling you something. What is not in dispute is what happened inside the Japanese government in those 8 days. The Supreme War Council was deadlocked. Half of it wanted to accept the Allied terms. Half wanted to fight one more great battle on the home islands, Operation Ketsugo, the defense of Kyushu, in the belief that a bloody enough repulse might produce better terms. And that was not a fantasy. Japanese planners had correctly predicted where the Americans would land. American signals intelligence in the summer of 1945 was watching Japanese forces build up on Kyushu far beyond what American planners had projected, and it frightened them badly. The deadlock broke because the emperor broke it. Twice, at a conference in the early hours of August 10th, and again on the 14th, Hirohito stated that the war must end. On the night of August 14th, a group of army officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender broadcast. They occupied the palace grounds and searched for the recording. They did not find it. The rebellion collapsed by morning. Major Hatanaka Kenji, 33, one of its leaders, took his own life. So did War Minister Anami Korechika, 58, who had opposed surrender and then refused to join a coup against his sovereign. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice for the first time. And on August 16, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro took his own life in his official residence. He left a written statement. He addressed it first to the young men he had sent out. He expressed his gratitude to the special attack pilots who had died, and he apologized to them and to their bereaved families, saying he had not achieved what he had asked their lives to buy. Then he addressed the survivors, the young men of Japan who were still alive, and told them to endure, to work for peace and for the rebuilding of their country, and not to be rash. The officer who formalized the suicide attack spent his last written words apologizing to the dead and telling the living to stay alive. On September 2, 1945, the American battleship Missouri lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru came aboard first, 58 years old, walking with a cane and an artificial leg, the result of a bombing in Shanghai in 1932. It took him some effort to reach the table. General Umezu Yoshijiro, 63, chief of the Army General Staff, followed him. They signed. Overhead, when it was done, hundreds of American aircraft came across the bay in formation. The war that 35 young researchers had gamed out in a Tokyo office in the summer of 1941 ended in broad outline as their report had described. the shipping destroyed, the economy collapsed, the Soviet Union in the field against them, the empire defeated. The bomb they had not foreseen, the architecture they had, and then something happened that many in Japan had not prepared for, because wartime propaganda had made it nearly unimaginable. Nothing happened. Understand the state of mind in Japan in late August of 1945. For years, the population had been told about the Kichikubayaye, the demonic beasts. Their own government's propaganda had suggested that an American occupation would mean mass killing and the end of the nation's existence. Japanese authorities believed their own material enough to take emergency measures in anticipation of the catastrophe they had helped invent, and to issue advisories urging civilians in exposed areas to be ready to flee. The Americans came ashore, and the catastrophe did not occur. Let us be honest about the record, because this account does not deal in comfortable stories. Crimes were committed by occupation personnel across the 7 years of the occupation. They happened. They were prosecuted inconsistently. Japanese civilians suffered from them, and that should not be smoothed over. But the annihilation that wartime propaganda had implied, the destruction of the Japanese people as a people, did not happen, not remotely, not in the same universe. What happened instead in that first winter was that Japan came very close to mass hunger, and the occupation authorities brought in food. What happened was that a public health system was rebuilt from almost nothing. What happened was that the schools reopened, and the children came back. Through late 1945 and into 1946, the evacuated schoolchildren of the Gakudo Sokai, the ones sent to the temples and the farm villages in 1944, were brought home from the countryside and returned to their families. Many came back to cities they could not recognize. Many came back to hardship that would go on for years, but they came back. One of the clearest things the Japanese wartime government ever got right was moving its children out of the way of a disaster it could see coming. And one of the cruelest effects of its own propaganda was that it made surrender, and then occupation, seem more terrifying than the reality that was actually waiting for those children's parents. 2 men have run through this entire story. It is time to see how it ended for both of them. Major General Kawaguchi Kiyotake, the officer who objected to the execution of a Filipino chief justice and was overruled, who attacked a ridge on Guadalcanal and wrote an honest report about why it failed, who challenged the axis assigned for the October offensive, was relieved after the dispute, and then watched that assault collapse amid many of the same terrain and coordination problems he had already lived through in September, survived the war. And in 1946, at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo, Kawaguchi appeared as a witness. He gave testimony concerning the execution of Jose Abad Santos. He described the order and his objection to it. He was not a hero. Let us keep the standard consistent all the way to the end. He was a general in a war of aggression who obeyed an army he sometimes disagreed with, and he did not stop what he objected to. 4 years earlier, his objection had been noted, set aside, and a man had been killed anyway. But in 1946, in a courtroom in Tokyo, the man who had put uncomfortable truths on paper on Guadalcanal put them on the record again, this time against his own institution, on a document that has outlived everyone in the room. And Tsuji Masanobu? Colonel Tsuji, the author of Read This Alone, the man who told Japanese soldiers that the American was effeminate and cowardly and would not fight in the rain. The staff officer whose name recurs in the historical debate over the treatment of prisoners in the Philippines and over the massacres of Chinese civilians in Singapore in early 1942. The man who came to Guadalcanal in the weeks when the officer with the most terrain experience was pushed aside. Tsuji Masanobu was never tried for anything. At the end of the war, he was in Southeast Asia, and he disappeared. He spent roughly 3 years moving through Thailand, Indochina, and China in disguise for part of it, waiting out the period in which war crimes prosecutions were most active. He returned to Japan in 1948, after the window had substantially closed. Then he wrote books about his own war record, and they sold extremely well. And then in 1952, he ran for the Japanese Diet, and he won. He served in the lower house, and later in the upper house, as an elected representative of the Japanese people. In 1961, at the age of 58, Tsuji traveled to Laos on a personal fact-finding trip into an active civil war. He was never seen again. He was declared legally dead in 1968. What became of him has never been established. So there is your ledger. The man who wrote the pamphlet was elected to Parliament. The man who challenged the plan was relieved in a jungle and is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a general who lost a battle on a ridge. And the American who spent his war proving you could get more out of an enemy by treating him decently than by breaking him. Sherwood Moran went home to Ohio, and outside the intelligence community, almost nobody ever knew his name. So we arrive at the question in the title. If all of this is on the record, if the Japanese government simulated the war and was told it would lose, if the commander of its combined fleet said a year in advance that he had no confidence in a long war, if its own propaganda described the empire being strangled with a silk cord, If the general with the freshest experience of the ground was removed on the eve of the biggest attack, if its most famous suicide pilot reportedly said his nation was finished, if its own civilians were nearly killed by the fear its own state had amplified, then why is so little of this in the story most of us grew up with? Why do we remember the Banzai charge and not the report in the drawer? At least 4 forces help explain why this evidence never became central to the popular story of the Pacific War. None of them requires a conspiracy. That is the uncomfortable part. Nothing had to be hidden. It only had to remain peripheral. The first is American, and it is the simplest. A fanatical enemy makes a cleaner story than a frightened one. If the Japanese soldier is a man who cannot be reasoned with, who does not calculate, who wants to die, then every hard decision made in that war becomes easier to explain. A frightened enemy who understood the odds and kept sending men anyway is a more disturbing thing to have fought. It raises questions that are painful for everyone. The second is Japanese, and it is more complicated. Post-war Japan built much of its national memory around 2 ideas: that ordinary Japanese people were victims of the war, which in the burned cities they were, and that the nation had been dragged into catastrophe by a militarist clique. Both contain truth, but neither leaves much room for the story you have just heard. A government that calculated carefully, understood a great deal of the risk, was warned repeatedly by its own professionals, and chose the war anyway. That version is not a story of being dragged. It is a story of walking, and walking is much harder to live with. The third is language. Japanese language records existed all along. The diaries of the emperor's closest advisors, the records of the imperial conferences, the Japanese official military history, running past 100 volumes, published across the 1960s and 1970s. Western historians did use Japanese sources, captured documents, interrogation reports, and translations, and they used them seriously. But language still slowed the movement of Japanese archival material into mass-market English-language history. Those records were far less likely than American combat memoirs and operational histories to shape the version of the Pacific War that an ordinary Western reader or an ordinary Western viewer actually encountered. And the fourth is the Cold War. By 1950, Japan was not a defeated enemy. It was the forward base of the American position in Asia, and the war in Korea made it indispensable. As that relationship formed, neither government had much incentive to make wartime culpability the organizing principle of the new alliance. Attention went elsewhere. It stayed there. And here is the thing I want to leave you with. None of this was a secret. There was no lost archive, no burned file, no conspiracy of silence. Nearly every document in this story has been sitting in the open for decades. The report from the summer of 1941, Yamamoto's warning to Konoe, the emperor's exchange with Sugiyama about the vastness of the Pacific, Kawaguchi's relief on the eve of the October offensive, the founding of the Escort Command in November of 1943, Seki Yukio's words to a war correspondent, Onishi's final statement, Oka Shohei's account of the shot he did not take, in print, in English, for decades. It was all there. The victors had little reason to center it. The defeated had reasons to remember differently. Language kept much of it away from the mass English-speaking audience, and Cold War politics pushed attention elsewhere. For decades, popular memory emphasized an enemy who seemed almost incapable of fear. The surviving Japanese record is messier and more disturbing. Again and again, senior officers and officials documented what they were afraid of. Economic strangulation, industrial inferiority, a war that would go long, exhaustion, a merchant fleet that could not be replaced. They saw much of the danger, and they went to war anyway. Now hold the last thing, because without it, the rest of this is worthless. None of that fear excuses one single thing the Japanese Empire did. Not Nanking. Not Bataan, not the prisoners who did not come home, not the millions of Chinese civilians, not one day of any of it. The fear is not a defense. A confident institution can afford to be corrected. It can hear that its plan is wrong and change it, because being wrong is survival. An institution that has decided it cannot afford to lose finds correction much harder to tolerate. It sidelines the officer who challenges the plan. It insists that spirit closes a gap that spirit cannot close. It sends 900 men across a sandbar because the number 2,000 was more comfortable than the number 11,000. It leaves tens of thousands of its own soldiers trapped on an island where hunger, disease, and combat kill them by the thousands. And when it has run out of everything else, it asks its 23-year-olds to fly into the sides of ships and calls it honor. Fear did not make the Japanese Empire gentler. It helped build machinery in which correction looked like weakness and retreat looked like betrayal. Oka Shohei lived until 1988. He was 79 years old when he died. He became one of the major writers of post-war Japan, and he spent much of his working life circling one morning on a mountainside on Mindoro when he had a young American in his sights and did not fire. He never did find the answer. He rode around it for 40 years and never once claimed a noble one, and the American walked on. That man never knew. He came down off that hill and went wherever the war took him next, and if he lived, he came home. He got off a ship. He married. He worked. He raised children who are grown now and grandchildren after them. He may have been a man from your town. He may have been your father, or your uncle, or the quiet neighbor who never talked about the Pacific. He never knew that on one morning in January of 1945, his entire life turned on a decision his enemy could not explain to himself for the next 40 years. That is the thing no propaganda on either side ever accounted for. They believed a man could be programmed. The pamphlet believed it. The code believed it. The loudspeakers and the posters and the field service regulations all believed it. And in the end, a great deal came down to a sick, starving 35-year-old translator of French novels, alone in the hills, who put down a rifle for reasons he could never name. Popular memory gave us an enemy who did not seem to be afraid. The paperwork says otherwise. They saw much of the danger, and they went anyway. And one of them, on one hillside, did not follow the paperwork either.